In 3ds Max, we notice that every time we do a render, and I'll just hit Shift Q to go ahead and render this out, you notice that there is lighting in this scene. Now, we never actually placed a light in this scene, so where's this light coming from? Well, let's go ahead and close this. There's actually default global lighting in 3ds Max. This is actually the default behavior of 3ds Max, so that when you go ahead and you render something out, you can actually see something here, okay? Now, as we can see, here's the global lighting. Now, there's no shadows, and the lighting is very plain, very simple, okay? It's just so you can actually see your scene here. The idea is to be able to create our own lighting and customize our lighting using Mental Ray and getting ourselves out some nice renders and customizing those renders however we like. Alright, so where is this global lighting? How do we control it? How do we alter it? So on and so forth. Well, up here in the render frame window, we can see there's a button here on the top right with a little kind of circle icon there. That's the environment effects window. So let's go ahead and open that up, and here's the environment effects window. You can also open up the environment effects window simply by going up here to the rendering main menu, and from here you can go to environment here, and you can see the shortcut is 8. So we'll click on that, and you can use 8 from now on the keyboard because it's a lot faster. So we have two different tabs here, effects and environment. Effects just controls different effects. For example, we can click on the add button here and we can add some lens effects, some blur, brightness and contrast, depth of field, and motion blur and things like that. We'll just hit cancel. Over here in the environment tab, we can choose a few different things. We can apply background image. So we can say use map. We can click on the none button here and we'll open up a material map browser. We can actually choose a bitmap and go into our system and choose an image that we can use as the background image of our render, which we're not going to do here. So I'll uncheck use map, I'll right click on the button here and hit clear to clear that out. We can also apply a background color. So if I go here, the default color is black. If I wanted blue, I can choose blue, hit OK, do another render here with Shift Q. You notice that the background now changes to blue. So I'll close that and I'll switch back to a black color, the default. Hit OK. Down here is our global lighting. You can see here we have a tint, so we can change the tint. Right now by default it's set to white, so it's pretty much neutral. If we wanted to though, we can change it to say green or blue, anything you like. And you notice now that in the viewport you can see there's a tint of that color. And if we go ahead and do a render, just as you would expect, here's a tint of that sort of bluish hue, as you can see. So we'll switch back to a neutral color, back to white. Hit OK. We can also change the level of the global lighting. By default, it's set to 1. So we can reduce the level of the global lighting to something very low. And the lighting is going to be very dark, as you can see here in the render. We can also increase that level to something past 1. So you can go to, say, 3.5. And now if we render, it's going to be extremely bright to the point where it's blown out and you really can't see anything. So I'll just go back to 1. We also have an ambient color here which we can adjust, and by default there's a small amount of ambience here, as you can see, very dark gray. You can change the ambient color to anything you like, so we can actually change this to say a bluish color or green. So we can go for green. The viewport, you see it changes to green. If we render this out, you get this green ambient color in your scene. So very simple controls here, very straightforward and easy to control. Down here we have exposure control. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in depth further on in another chapter inside this training product. For right now, we're just going to skip it because we're going to talk about it and dedicate a lot of time to that later. Okay, so that's the global lighting in 3ds Max. Now let's talk about the actual lights inside of 3ds Max. When we start to create lights here in 3ds Max, things start to get more interesting. So let's start here by creating standard lights. In 3ds Max we have different kinds of lights. We have standard 3ds Max lights. We have standard photometric lights. We also have Mental Ray lights. And we have standard Mental Ray lights as well as photometric Mental Ray lights. So let's look at all of these lights. We can access the create menu to create lights from a couple of different places on the interface. We can go to the main menu item that says create up here. We can go down to the lights menu, and from here we can choose photometric lights. Okay, and we have two photometric lights that are standard max lights. We can also choose this one here that says MR at the beginning, which is short for Mental Ray, and this is a Mental Ray specific light, in this case the Sky Portal. We also have standard lights. We can choose standard 3dsMax lights, which actually work with mental ray. We can also choose mental ray specific lights, like the area spot and the area Omni Light. Okay. We also have a daylight system, and we'll actually be looking at that later in this tutorial, but we're actually going to dedicate a chapter to that later, so we won't get into that at the moment. Right now, let's have a look at just basic standard 3dsMax lights. We have a few different ones. We have a target spotlight, free spotlight, target directional, and regular directional. We also have an Omni and a skylight. Let's start here with the top and look at the target spotlight. We'll click on that, and then what we can do is just click somewhere here in our scene. I'll just go ahead and click over here and then just drag, let go of the mouse button right here at the center, and there we go. Then I'll hit the right mouse button to end the creation process. And basically what we've done, we've created ourselves a spotlight. So I'll just use the move tool here to move this spotlight up here. And you can see the icon of the spotlight is a cone shape. We also get this other icon that's over here. And this is actually the target of the spotlight. Wherever I move this object, the spotlight is going to face, almost like a flashlight. So it's targeting this little dummy helper object right here, this little square, this cube. It's going to go ahead and determine where the spotlight faces. So with this spotlight created, let's go ahead and do a render, preview render here, and we can see what we have. It's a spotlight shape, and this light is good for doing things like flashlights or any type of lighting you would see in a theater or something like that. You can use this spotlight for, so it's actually pretty useful, or car headlights, anything like that. Now you can see that there's no shadows associated with this light. That's because shadows are off by default. So how do we control this? Well, we can control our light parameters here from the command panel. The command panel is this entire section here on the right. In the command panel, we can go ahead and click on the second button here, which is the modify button or modify tab. Okay, let's select the light. When we select the light, now we can see we have a whole bunch of different parameter rollouts and parameters active here in the command panel. In order to not deselect this light accidentally like this, just by clicking on editor at the video, there was a car in the background. Starting in 3, 2, 1. In order to keep our parameters here in the command panel and not lose them by accidentally clicking on empty space and now they're gone, then I have to select the light again, we can actually hit the space bar to lock down the selection. You can see down here in the lower part of the interface we have a selection lock toggle button. We can turn that on and off. When we turn it on, the background will be yellow. What this means is that I can't select anything in my scene. As you can see, I can click all I want on objects in my scene and I won't be able to deselect this object. So this is pretty useful. I'll be using it from now on with the shortcut spacebar on the keyboard. Okay, we have general parameters here. We also have intensity, color, attenuation. We have spotlight parameters. We have advanced effects, so on and so forth. You can see we have a whole bunch of different options. We even have special mental ray indirect illumination options here, and we'll be looking at that in a future chapter in this training product. So don't worry about that now. We'll go over that in a lot of detail later. Okay, so general parameters, we can change the light type. We can actually change from a spot to a directional or omni. Now if we go back to the create menu here, we go to lights, we go to standard lights, you notice that we have spotlight here, we have directional, and we have an omni light. What happens is that you're not stuck with this light. You can actually change it. If I want to, I can change it to a directional light, and you can see the icon changes. And the way it renders also changes as well, as you can see here. If I change it to an omni light, now it just changes to an omni light. And we'll talk about Omni Lights in a moment. You can see that when I render out, it changed as well. And then I can go back to Spotlight. So what it comes down to is that if you create a specific type of light, you can actually go ahead and change your mind later and switch to a different type of light that maybe you meant to create before, or maybe something looks better another way, so you change your mind. You can do that. Okay? You can also turn the light on and off. So I can go ahead and uncheck that. If I render out, you notice that now the light is not rendering out. You also notice that when I was switching from directional and omni lights, I lost my little target down here. I can click on this target button to bring it back. And you can see it's a little bit hard to see, but it's actually down here. It moved, unfortunately. But that's okay. It doesn't matter. It's still facing that specific direction. Okay? Now, you notice that when we render out, we get no shadows. We can turn on shadows by turning this option on right here. And once we do that, if we render again, now we'll get shadows. And what we're getting is shadow maps. I can choose the different types of shadow types down here in this drop-down menu. So you can see the default is shadow mapped. We can choose advanced ray trace, mental ray shadow maps, area shadows, shadow maps, and ray trace shadows. Now the advanced ray trace here, if we go ahead and render this out, what we're going to get is this message window that opens up. Let's close the render frame window. And what this mental ray message window does is it pops up whenever there's certain errors. Okay, sometimes there's things that mental ray doesn't support in 3ds Max, and when that situation occurs, you'll get this mental ray message window that pops up by default, and it's going to tell you in red right here what's going on. In this case, I get a message error. It basically says shadow generator advanced ray trace on light spot 1 blah 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 is unsupported. Mental ray, so on and so forth, blah 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 blah. What it's basically telling you in a strange cryptic language is that, hey, mental ray is not compatible with 3ds Max's advanced ray trace shadows, so you can't use that. It's not going to render out. Okay, so there's specific options here that you can use and specific options you can't use. Now obviously if it says mental ray in front of it, that means you can use it. So mental ray shadow maps, for example, if I go ahead and render that out, will actually render out without a problem, and we get no error messages or anything like that. It just renders out fine. Okay. We also have area shadows here. If I go ahead and hit render, we get ourselves another error message. Again, mental ray is complaining. Hello, it's basically telling us, look, area shadows, 3ds Max area shadows do not work with mental ray. They don't work with me, so stop trying to render out with area shadows. So we can't use area shadows with mental ray. Now, regular 3ds Max shadow maps, if we go ahead and hit render, you notice we get no error. Regular 3ds Max shadow maps do render out just fine with mental ray, but I do recommend sticking with the mental ray shadow maps instead of using the 3ds Max shadow maps. Then we have ray trace shadows. Ray trace shadows do render out with mental ray. If we hit render, we get no error message. So it's okay to use ray trace shadows with mental ray. So you want to stick with mental ray shadow maps or ray trace shadows. Shadow maps from 3ds Max works. Area shadows don't, and advanced ray trace shadows don't. Let's leave it on ray trace shadows for the moment. Okay. And we also have intensity and color attenuation. We can actually change the intensity of the light simply by increasing this multiplier. So you can see, as we increase the multiplier, the light becomes brighter and brighter and brighter. As we decrease, it becomes dimmer. We can also change the color of the light. If we like to, we can actually come in here and maybe give this thing sort of a bluish hue or cyan. Render this out, and we'll get that color rendered out. I'll just change that back to the default white. Now, decay. Decay is very important. By default, set to none. Decay, as you notice, is controlling the brightness of the light. Okay. Now, in real life, lights actually use decay. Light energy actually decreases and falls off depending on the distance. The farther the distance, the more the light is going to decay. And we have two options for light decay, inverse and inverse square. Inverse is a linear fall off. It's not very realistic. If we go ahead and render this out, a little bit hard to tell, but the light falls off in intensity linearly. So you can see here at the beginning, it's very bright and hot. Right here toward a longer distance or farther distance from the light, you notice that it's not as bright as it is over here closer to the light. Now, inverse square is the way to go if you're going for photorealism, simply because inverse square follows the same formula that real light energy uses in the real world. So if you're going for photorealism and authenticity, you want to go with inverse square. You can see it becomes very dim and dark over here, farther away from the light, and closer to the light, these points get very hot and very bright. Okay, let's look at spotlight parameters. Here you can actually choose a few different options here for the light cone shape. So if I close this, you notice that the shape is shown here with this light cone icon, which is this blue color. Okay, what I can do is I can change the hotspot or beam. So right now by default it's set to 43 degrees. I can actually increase that, and as I increase it, interactively increases in size here inside of my viewport. So if I go ahead and do a render, you notice that the cone shape is actually much larger than before. If I go ahead and increase that some more, render out again, you notice that now it got larger. And again, I can actually decrease this hotspot or the beam. And you notice that the outer edges here become softer. That's because of the fall off field. As long as the fall off here field is larger than a hotspot beam, you're going to get yourself those very nice soft edges on the spotlight. So if I hit render here, you notice it becomes very soft on the edges right here. That's because I'm using a hotspot of 49 degrees and a fall off of 79. Now if I put them closer to each other, very close to each other, to the point where the hotspot here, or the beam, is almost the same size as the fall off, you notice that I get myself a very hard edge here in the spotlight, which can be what you want, or maybe it's what you don't want. Maybe you want the softer edge so you can reduce the hotspot beam, get yourself a nice soft edge, which actually looks a little bit more realistic. Okay, you can also change the shape from circle to rectangle. So you can see here I get a rectangular shape on the actual cone shape of the spotlight, which is no longer a cone shape, it's rectangle. Okay, I have some advanced effects. I can control the contrast of the light, so on and so forth. I can also turn off the specular contribution or the diffuse contribution. Maybe I just wanted to contribute to the ambient lighting only. So if I go ahead and hit render, you see I only get ambient lighting here. Okay, I can also control the shadow parameters. So depending on the shadow type that I have set up here under the general parameters, I have shadows. I have it set to ray trace shadows, so I can actually go ahead and change those parameters. I can change the color of the shadows here from black to say blue for whatever reason, if that's what I wanted to do. You can now notice that my shadows are blue. I can change the density of the shadows, so if I lower the density and I render again, my shadows will look more transparent. As you can see here, they're a lot less dense than before. I like to leave it at the default value of 1, and color black is fine. Black looks good. Okay, and then we have some ray trace shadow parameters here. We can control a few different parameters, make it two-sided shadows. We can change the ray bias here. We also have some atmospheres and effects, so we can add an effect here, like say a volume light or a lens effect. Not going to go over that now though, because really that doesn't pertain to mental ray. And over here we have a mental ray indirect illumination. I didn't like that actually. You know what? Edit that out of the video. We're going to start again in 3, 2, 1. Then we have atmospheres and blah, blah, blah. Then we have atmospheres and effects, so we can add a certain effect, like say volume light effect. If I hit OK, I have a volume light effect. If I render this out, you notice now that there's this sort of misty volume effect attached to the light, which can actually add some nice depth and some little bit of fog to the scene here. So it looks almost like it's very foggy light, and maybe in some dark room in the back of a bar or something where some guys are spending their weekend night gambling and playing some poker or something like that. So volume light's pretty neat. I can hit delete to get rid of it, and if I render again, it's completely gone now. Okay, so that's atmospheres and effects. Then we have mental ray indirect illumination, which we'll talk about later very in depth, so you'll understand how that works. Then we have mental ray light shader. What we can do is actually we can apply light shaders, mental ray light shaders, to the light. So if I click here on none, I can apply some different mental ray light shaders. Now this is kind of obsolete because we don't really need to use any of this stuff. Really, there's really no need to use it. We don't have to use that. It's actually better if we don't. We actually have some pretty good light settings that we can use in mental ray for 3dsMax, so it's not really necessary. We also have some photon emitter shaders, but we actually don't have any we can plug in here. There's none in here by default. If you're a mental ray shader programmer, though, you can create your own and you can plug them in. So the option's there, but we're not going to deal with that because it's not necessary and it's not really important to what we need to do. There's really no need to use it. Okay, so there we go. That's the spotlight here. Now there are other types of lights. If I go ahead and take this light and hit delete on the keyboard to get rid of it, I can go back to the create menu, go back to standard lights. I have the free spotlight. Now the free spotlight is the same exact thing as the target spotlight. There's only one difference. And the difference is that the free spotlight, if I go to the modify tab here, just has the targeted parameter turned off. So if I turn this on, now it's a targeted spotlight. If I go back and turn it off, now it's a free spotlight. So you can see here it's a spotlight, and now it's free, now it's targeted, now it's free again. So that's all that is. So I'm going to take that light and delete it. So that's the only difference there between this standard target spotlight and standard free spotlight. Now the target directional light and the directional light are the same exact thing. They're both directional lights, only one, as you probably guessed, has a target and the other one is free. So let's look at the targeted one here. We'll go ahead and create that right here. If we move it up, zoom out a little bit, you can see it's going to be targeted here. Right now it's got a square shape to it. That's okay. Let's go back to the modify panel here, and the shortcut for that is 2 on the keyboard. Okay. Now if we go down to the directional parameters, we have it set right now to rectangle. Let's switch it to circle, and there we go. Okay, so directional light works almost like a sunlight, but at the same time it kind of works as a spotlight, simply because if I go ahead and go to the these parameters here, like the fall off, and I reduce it by a good amount and I render this out, you're going to notice that it creates this sort of spotlight effect there in the center. Let's turn on the shadows for it, render again, so it renders out with shadows. There's some nice shadows right there. Now you notice it creates sort of this spotlight beam effect. Okay, this light kind of works like a sunlight though, because this light actually is shooting out the parallel directional rays from up here, from this direction. Okay, so if we go ahead and we increase the size of it to encompass our entire scene, we can actually simulate a sort of sunlight here. And if we move it around, we can make this simulated sunlight come from an angle. So you can see it's coming from the top right angle, so it looks kind of like it's maybe 1 o'clock in the afternoon or something like that. Okay, so that's the directional light, and all these other parameters are the same. The intensity, color, and attenuation is the same. For example, the decay parameters, the multiplier, the color parameter, the shadow parameters are the same. The atmospheres and effects parameters are the same. Ray trace shadow parameters are the same. The mental ray indirect illumination parameters are the same. All these parameters are basically the same. So there's no need to go over every single parameter again, because we've already been over the spotlight. And since the parameters are practically identical, if you already know the parameters for the spotlight, you pretty much already know the parameters for the directional light. So that's the directional light for you. I'm going to go ahead and delete it. Go back to the create menu. I'm going to go to lights, standard lights. Now we have an Omni light. Now the Omni light's different, and there's only one type of Omni light, which is this free Omni light. So what is the Omni light? If we go ahead and render, you'll notice what it's like. The Omni light, let's go to the modify panel here, and we can actually modify a few parameters. For example, I'll turn on shadows. I'll give it some inverse square fall off here, make it more realistic. Render again. Now the Omni light simulates a single light source similar to a bulb, like a light bulb. It's one point in space that shoots out light rays in all directions, 360 degrees all around it, above it, to the sides, front, back, and bottom. Okay, so it's not like a spotlight or like a directional light. It has no direction. It just shoots light everywhere, like a light bulb. So that's how an Omni light works. And again, the parameters are virtually identical to before. We do have a few parameters here for the shadows, for the advanced effects, things like that, and they're the same as for the other types of lights. So again, if you're already familiar with the parameters for the other lights, then you're pretty familiar with the parameters for this light, even if you don't even know it yet. Okay, so we could change the color, the intensity by changing the multiplier. We can give it some light decay, so we can go with inverse or inverse square, and so on and so forth. Let's reduce that light a little bit right there. Render that out again. That looks pretty neat. Okay, so there you go. So that's the Omni light. Pretty simple to understand and use. Okay. Now down here we have some mental ray lights, and we're going to go over that in another video. We're not going to go over that now. Right now what I wanted to show you was the standard 3dsMax lights. And another thing, if you may have or may have not noticed, is that even though they're 3dsMax lights, they render out just fine with mental ray. So we can use 3dsMax lights with mental ray, which is simply great, because it means we have more options for lights and more flexibility with lights in 3dsMax and mental ray. Okay, so that's going to cover the overview here of the standard 3dsMax lights. I'm going to end this video here. In the next video, we're going to talk about photometric lights in 3dsMax and how we can render them out with mental ray.